Well, certainly was a big year in politics with the federal election in May and the South Australian and Victorian state elections. To look back at some of the highlights, joining me live is Dr Zareh Ghazarian, Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Monash University. How are you?
Good, thanks, Janie. Good to be with you.
Great to be with you. A lot to get through in only a few minutes, but let's start off winding back the clock to March, the state election in South Australia, which was held the 19th of March to elect members of the 55th Parliament of South Australia. And Labor formed a majority government with Peter Malinauskas sworn in, but there was much talk of the Liberals losing the election mainly to the management of COVID. What are your thoughts?
It was a really interesting start to the year, wasn't it? The first general election of the year, Janie, of course, in March, and South Australians went to the polls, and they gave us really a taste of things to come when it came to election results this year. And we saw that the South Australians opened up just ahead of that Omicron wave, and we saw how that had an impact, especially on the health system in the state. And health really became one of those issues that defined the state election of South Australia, I believe. And we saw Labor in opposition really lobby very hard on the issue of health, and arguably that allowed them to win and to get the result that they did, which is a pretty remarkable result, considering this was a first-term government. And also, it's worth remembering that state elections during the pandemic, so in Queensland, Western Australia, Tasmania, they all resulted in the government retaking power. So they were remaining in power. But the South Australian was an odd one out, because that's where we had a change of government, and it was primarily based on health and health management.
Yeah, well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in New South Wales in February next year, which we'll talk about shortly. But the federal election, that was, a big focus on health as well. Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison was hoping to win a fourth consecutive term in office. However, for the first time in 15 years, Labor achieved a majority government, and that's despite a record non-major party vote in crossbench.
That's right, and that's a really interesting result here, because what we saw was the major parties lose ground. So the coalition went back by about 6% when we look at their primary vote. We saw Labor's result go back as well. But what, of course, transpired was that the coalition lost 18 seats, Labor won 8, and the Greens did relatively better than they had in the past by winning 4 seats. So that was a pretty big story, but I think something else was a really big story, of course, as well, and that was the rise of independents and the rise of the Teals in particular. And when we look at those Teal independents, they achieved an incredible result, winning seats that the Liberal Party had traditionally held, seats like Mackellar, North Sydney, Goldstein, of course, in Victoria, Kooyong as well. These were true Liberal strongholds, and here appeared these independents. They ran very hard on issues concerning integrity, on issues concerning climate change, and they attracted a lot of support. So it's going to be very interesting to see how in the next year and the coming years, the coalition, and in particular the Liberal Party, responds to the challenge and the threat that now exists for them, not in the form of another political party, but in the form of independence.
Yeah, absolutely. In the Victorian election, November, Dan Andrews securing a historic third term. What do you think was missing in the Liberals' campaign?
Well, the Liberals were hamstrung by organisational problems. There was internal disputes, internal conflicts, and really in Victoria, as has been the case across the country, the Liberals have been unsettled and really struggling to determine how they're going to reconcile the difference between those members of Parliament and those broader members who have more socially conservative views and those who have more socially progressive views. And that became a problem because it spilled out into disputes, and it really hobbled the Liberal Party. It was only in the last few weeks of the campaign that we got a sense that the Liberal Party was really on an election footing. But by that stage, people had already made up their mind, and Labor, as you pointed out, not only had a comfortable victory, but actually increased its number of seats in the Victorian Parliament from 55 to 56, which is an extraordinary result for a government that has been in power for 8 years.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And we're going to be looking out for much more in 2023, including the New South Wales state election on March 25. But we do have to wrap it up there, unfortunately. But thank you always so much for your time and expertise this year. Have a wonderful 2023 and we'll talk to you again soon.